Welcome, everyone. I'm Samantha Hoffman. I'm VP of the Chicago Writers Association and Executive Director of Let's Just Write, an Uncommon Writers Conference. Thanks for joining us today for Cocktails and Conversation. If you haven't tuned in before, this is a series where we chat with people who have presented at our previous conferences and who will be presenting again when we resume for our in-person event, which will be March 19th and 20th. 2022, which seems so far away when we rescheduled, but it's not that far away anymore. I'm very excited. You can find out more information about the conference and see how to register on our website at chicagowrites.org and just click on the tab for the conference. This event will be posted to our YouTube channel later today or tomorrow. So if you have to leave early for some reason, you can see what you missed, and we'll send out a link. And you'll also find the other Cocktails and Conversation events that we've done in the past, and there's some great conversations on there. So don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you have any questions or comments during this discussion, please put them in the chat window, which you can find by going to the bottom of your screen and clicking chat. It's kind of challenging to do this and read the comments at the same time, but I'm going to try to monitor them. And if your question is relevant to what we're discussing, I'll jump in with that question. Otherwise, we'll try to get to them all at least by the end of the program. I have my cocktail. Everybody have a cocktail? I hope you're enjoying it. Cheers to everyone. And now I want to introduce my fellow board member, Dan Burns. Dan is the author of 7 books, including the recently launched poetry collection, A Necessary Explosion. He's received a number of awards for his work, and 2 of his works have been adapted for the stage. So I'm very excited to have Dan with us here today. And now let me introduce Faisal Mohyuddin. He is a writer, an artist, an educator. He's the author of The Displaced Children of Displaced Children. Dan, hold up the book. There you go, it's a beautiful cover. That book won the 2017 Sexton Prize in Poetry and went on to receive a number of other awards. Faisal is also the author of the chapbook, The Riddle of Longing, and his recent work has appeared in numerous publications. The child of immigrants from Pakistan and is a graduate of Carleton College, Northwestern University, and Columbia College, Chicago. He's an educator, advisor, and master practitioner for the global not-for-profit Narrative 4, and teaches at Highland Park High School in Illinois and at the School of Professional Studies at Northwestern University. Faisal lives in Oak Park, Illinois, and I welcome you here today with us, Faisal. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Samantha and Dan, and thank you all of you that are here. So I've been a big fan of the Chicago Writers Association for a while, and so this is a big honor to be invited here, so thank you.
Great. So I'm going to just start with a few questions, and the 3 of us are going to have a discussion. It's going to be very fluid, and we'll just chat. And what I'm hoping for, I am not a poetry person. There is some poetry that I like. There are some poets that I follow. Billy Collins comes to mind, Mary Oliver comes to mind, and to me, their poetry is very accessible, and that's important to me. But I can't say I always understand poetry. And just an aside, I met Faisal about 3 or 4 years ago at our friend Patty McNair's. She had a reading for people who had just launched a new book. And Faisal read his poetry at that time, and I was blown away. And like I said, I'm not a poetry person, so that just felt really good. So that's one of the reasons I invited him here today, because I'm hoping he can enlighten me and maybe enlighten other people in this audience about poetry and help. I want help to appreciate it more. But first, tell me how you, when did you start writing poetry and what was your inspiration for that?
Sure. Well, thank you again for the kind words and the welcome. And I also want to thank everyone who is here. I see people from the western part of Illinois. Lynn is here. I see people from down the street in Oak Park. Margot is here. My dear friend and amazing poet, Leah Umansky from New York is here. Sean Shiflett was my thesis advisor at Columbia College. And I think Sarah's here as well. But yeah, everyone who's here who I know, thank you. Everyone who's not here, thank you. I'm
sorry, we have a lot of people who have come to almost all of these events. So
yes, yeah.
We welcome all of you back again. Thanks for attending.
Thank you. And especially, it's such a lovely day outside. So it's always a bigger, a bigger sense of gratitude that I feel when people are like taking time out of a beautiful, lovely summer Chicago day to be here. So I started writing in high school, actually. So I was not a writer growing up. I always loved visual art, so I had the creative kind of bug in me since the beginning, but writing was not my thing at all. And then I went to high school at Friend High School in Palatine, and one of the most important parts of my experience there was just having teachers. I feel like maybe the entire English department there at the time and still was always encouraging creative writing. And at times it was just for fun, sometimes as part of a class assignment, sometimes for extra credit. We used to have poetry slams every month or two, just, people, the teachers would put it on, and then any class that wanted to join could just go there. And sophomore year, I just started keeping a journal. It was like an extra credit thing in one of my classes. And then from there, I just went from like this I'm doing as kind of a goofy exercise, a chance to get some extra points, to realizing that as a really quiet, shy person, this was how I could kind of speak up or speak out. And slowly over the course of high school and then definitely in college, and then without looking back afterwards, it was like, this is really important to me. I really love doing it. And I had a lot of encouragement all along the way to be like, oh, this is something that's really nice that you're doing, keep doing it.
Yeah, so would you tell that story that you posted on Facebook the other day about your teacher?
I will, yeah. So I work at Highland Park High School, and so one of my colleagues, Ann Isaacson is her name, and she just retired from teaching. And so before she was a teacher in the department, she was the head librarian at Highland Park High School. And she loves poetry, obviously loves books, and she many years ago when I first started writing, like knew that I enjoyed writing. And I think somehow we started talking. I shared some poems with her, and then she shared some poems with me, and we used to just get together and talk writing. And she would write like a poem every holiday time for the holidays and make it into a card. And at some point, she was putting together the National Poetry Month display in the library, and without telling me, she basically took all the poems of mine, and she didn't tell me as a surprise. I mean, it wasn't like stepping over her bounds, but she printed out all of my poems, got a binder, put them in there, put a little bio in there, put a table of contents, and found a picture of me, made a cover for the binder, and then she put it up on the display in the library and said to me, I still remember this, like, you belong here too. And this was years ago. This is probably 2005, maybe 2006. I may have only published 1 or 2 poems at that point. And then, about 10 years later, she wanted to teach full time. And so then she joined our department. We sat next to each other. And so we've had this really awesome relationship. And she's the one person out of everybody in my department that's been really encouraging and exciting about me writing. So that's been a really great.
It's such a lovely story.
Yeah. And so I wanted to just honor that gesture, and then a gift, something to just tell her how much I appreciate her, how much I'm going to miss her.
Right. So I think we were talking about your original inspiration for poetry.
Yes. So it was doing it in class, and so the story that I have to always add is that I was like a super shy person. So as you mentioned, the bio, my parents immigrated from Pakistan, were Muslim, pretty traditional, not super traditional, but traditional enough where one of the things that was always like a topic of controversy is too strong, but a difficult topic to talk about was like romance and love and crushes and all this. And I was the oldest of 5 kids, and I was a super goody two-shoe kid growing up. And I would like develop a crush on a girl and know that this could go nowhere. There's no place to even talk about it. And so as I was writing, like it became more and more about like, how can I like give a place for those feelings or those emotions to come out. And I had 4 younger siblings, and I knew that if they saw me writing something romantic or cheesy or whatever, like if they found it, I was gonna get hell. Like they were gonna like, yeah, we're gonna get our brother for this. And so I started writing in code where I wouldn't come out and say directly what I wanted to say. I'd never use her name, I would never use it. And so it was like these metaphoric exercises of like, I'm this shy, quiet kid. I have this fantasy about this one, whatever. Just like, it was like, I just said hello to her and she said hi back. And so these poems, they became poems. And then from there, like that was like the first thing. I'm like, I don't know how to talk about it. I'm not supposed to talk about it. I can't talk about it because I'm way too shy. And then there were other things that were more important. I said, teenagers are rebellious, or they started questioning certain things that they're supposed to accept, whether it's about school or about faith or about community or what we want to do in our lives. And so I started thinking of other topics that were maybe taboo topics, and started writing about them again in metaphor. And over the course of time, it was like, wow, this is a really important way to just express myself. And I was reading a lot of poetry. Like, I think there were so many poems or poets I was reading. I was like, wow, there's some really incredible things people are saying, whether it's in poem or fiction or nonfiction. But like, writing was something that became really important and necessary, and then also like fun. Like I was always enjoying myself when I was doing writing. And then there was a playfulness at school as well. Like you could just come to class, and I had teachers that would make space for this and say like, I've written something, and if not that day, the next day or later that week, we would get a chance to share it with the class, and it would be this really nice, warm appreciation and response. And so it felt like, okay, I'm not just doing this for myself, I'm doing it as part of my classroom experience too.
Did you write fiction before you wrote poetry, or vice versa?
I started with poetry, and I stuck with poetry. And then those of you that know my work know that I write a lot of long poems, and I do love stories, and I do love fiction. And when I was doing poems, I remember a few. I got a few rejection letters from some journals. They're like, these aren't poems, these are stories. Like these are too big for stories. And I had also thought about stories I want to tell. So I actually studied with Sean, who's here. I got my MFA in fiction writing at Columbia College. And even while I was working on that, I knew that I wasn't like no longer a poet. I also wanted to learn how to write fiction and to have the options and how to express myself. And the fiction I realized was way more difficult for me to do, sustaining something that's as long as a novel. I spent forever in the program, and I'm still, I feel like I'm working on that series of projects that are more fiction-based. I do love stories. I love reading them. I love, even in my mind, I feel like I'm composing stories more often than I'm composing poems when I'm walking around in my head.
I forgot that I was going to ask you to read a poem before we began. Could you do that now?
Sure, I can definitely read that. So thank you, Sean. I see some of the chats coming in. So I'm going to read a new poem. So I wrote this a little bit over a year ago. So this is when the pandemic first kicked in, and I was up at all hours. Like I could, we were teaching from home, and the sleep schedule there's no sleep schedule. So it was just this strange timelessness. And one thing that was happening, I would sit in my kitchen and look out, and all of a sudden, like the back, we have this automatic light that kicks on when like a motion sensing light. And then every once in a while, like the light would come on, I'd see a rabbit or I'd see a raccoon. And so this is a poem inspired by seeing some raccoons crossing through our backyard during the pandemic. And then I have a friend named Hari Alluri who lives in Vancouver, and he and I would do these like midnight to 2 a.m. writing sessions. And so this I got to dedicate, just honor his this. So this is called Trespass. In the backyard, when one trips the motion sensor, another raccoon freezes, netted now by the wince of unwanted light, while the first, banded tail bouncing, dissolves into the blackness. With a clutch of distant thunder in my belly, I realize it's been stationed there for some time. Supple coat, disheveled by rain, watching me, perhaps wondering what this human, face obscured by weeks of scruff, is doing at this assassin's hour, perched inside his kitchen's bay window, no mug of herbal tea for comfort, no turn toward a breaking voice saying, please just come back to bed. For 2 minutes, in drizzle softened light, we inhabit a hungry solitude, eyes yoked, sharing the faltering orbit of abandonment. Me wishing I spoke raccoon, so I could shout through the glass to ask its business, if it's brought news. Then the guillotine of darkness, my companion snuffed out, me squinting into the rain, still holding fast to what was there.
Beautiful.
Very nice.
Thank you. Yeah, it's published online. I can put I'll put the link to it.
There, yeah. You know, it's beautiful to me because it makes me feel something. And that, to me, is what poetry should do. But what if I don't feel something? I mean, I've read some poetry that didn't evoke anything in me that's considered wonderful poetry. How do I learn enough about poetry to appreciate it?
You know, I think that's like the most important question. And then I know, Dan, you're also a poet, and so you feel free to chime in. And I think for me, like I started appreciating poetry more by writing it than by reading it. And it was essentially like the thing I liked about poetry was the way it was my early understanding of it. In some ways, it's still true. Is like it's a smaller thing. It can exist on 1 or 2 pages. You can sit down and just do, even like I love haiku. I'm writing haiku all the time, but like it's a small thing. And by writing it, I started thinking about like what is it that I'm enjoying doing as a writer? Like what are some things that I'm doing, some tricks or some playfulness or some structural things or metaphoric things, whatever they are. And the more I was writing, then I started looking for other poems or poets that were doing similar things or poems that I just enjoyed for whatever reason. And it was never about understanding so much. It was more about, like you said, Samantha, the feeling. And I think that, so part of it is like just looking for poems that speak to you. And if a poem doesn't leave an emotional impact or doesn't make you feel something, and it's considered a great poem or someone else loves it, like there's nothing wrong with the poem, there's nothing wrong with the reader. It just may not be the right moment to read that poem, or it may not be, whatever my life experiences are going to be different from yours and each other person's. And there's different like doorways in our hearts and different windows in there and different mirrors that exist. And certain poems will enter right in. Some poems will kind of like peek into us and kind of like help us look out. Some poems are going to like help us see ourselves better in that sense. So I think that if you're someone that's like, I'm not sure about poetry or poetry intimidates me, or I mean, you mentioned Billy Collins and Mary Oliver, like 2 of my favorite poets. I love them because they're accessible. Mary Oliver, I think for me, is on a much deeper level of kind of spiritual consciousness and natural consciousness. I also love poems that I read them. I'm like, I have no idea what to make of this. I love the complexity. I love the mystery. I love the fact that it's like something I have to sit with for a long time and like open it up and and take it apart. And I think it's also the kind of moment you're in. Like if I have time and I want a poem that makes me work for a while, I'm gonna enjoy that poem. If I'm moving quickly through life or I'm really busy, that poem may just feel like something it missed the point or I missed it. So I think that reading a lot of poems, like reading, the nice thing with the poem is they're small. You're not investing, like there's a novel, sometimes I'll love a novel 3/4 of the way through. And then at some point I'm like, oh, I'm not loving the way it's coming to an end. And at the end of it, I feel a different kind of disappointment. I still love that I read it and I still love what I've learned from it. But I don't think that the feeling of I sank too much time into a poem is something I worry about. And I think for most people, like if it doesn't work for you, move on to the next thing. And there's so many poets right now, so many great poets, so many people writing in different ways. I think that everybody has a poem or several poems and poets out there. And it's just like, how do you make that introduction? Like this is meet Samantha, meet poem, etc. Meet Dan, meet the poem, and making. And as I'm always looking on social media, like what poems are people posting? If there's journals that I like, I want to read every poem in there. I want to definitely read poems by people who I don't know. Like that's someone I don't know yet. I want to invest a lot of time in getting to know their work.
Yeah, I'll just add in that, I concur that it's all about reading as many poets as you can. I've been on this kind of journey for over 20 years of trying to find poets that, kind of speak to me. And whether it's ones that move me or make me think, I was looking for poets both from a reader standpoint and as a writer of poetry to see if I'm on the right track. And I think through my journey, I found that if something didn't quite speak to me, that was okay. Move on to the next one. There are hundreds, thousands to choose from. And over the years, I've settled into this group of, 20, 30 poets that I always read. And I'm always looking for new ones. And I will say that, Faisal, you've come into that fold now. Talk about, accessibility. I like to write poems that I like to read, and I like poems that are accessible. And reading your poems are, they certainly come across that way. So, fine job on that. I'll mention to the rest of the group that before we started, I was talking to Faisal that I'm reading The Displaced Children of Displaced Children, and I'm about 2/3 of the way through. One of the surprising things that I got from the book is, and I guess I don't get this from a lot of poetry books, that, I never met you before today, 20 minutes ago. And yet in reading your poems, your stories, I feel that I know you and your family, even if it's just a small bit. And whether that was your objective or not, you accomplished that. And I think that's an awesome aspect of poetry. If you can um, make somebody feel something, make somebody think, make somebody understand your story. And I guess after all that commentary, let me ask a question, if I could. When you're writing a poem, do you make a conscious determination about how much information, how much to spell out for the reader versus how much to leave to their subjective interpretation, whether that's about yourself or your meaning or your message?
I mean, that's like, I think it's a question we all are asking all the time. Like, what do we want to have on the page when it's done? Like, what's left? And I think I know everyone here who's a writer knows this. That so much of getting to the final version, whatever that is weeks and hours and months, whatever that is, the amount. I mean, I think this Trespass poem, I almost was going to share the document, but that sense of, I think there were like 40 different drafts of it, and some are longer, some are shorter. Some things, I left things in there, I took some things out. My friend, Ari, who helped me with this. And so one thing I'm constantly doing is like, always like, what is it that I want to leave And what do I want to, I mean, not necessarily what I want to leave, like what do I want to be there? What is that experience for the reader going to be? And it also depends on the poem. Like with this poem, something has happened, like in my mind, like it's a fictionalized kind of context for it based on a real moment. I don't give any information about what that thing that's happened is, but somehow the reaction to that thing is in the poem. And the presence of the raccoon is bringing to the surface some of that mystery. And so I could have said, this person is going through a rough patch with their partner. Or I could have said, this person's partner has left them. And that's not, you know, based on reality. It's like, this is like going in that fiction side of it. Like there's a fictional element here, but if I put that on the page, then there's one less thing for a reader to wonder about. And so I want to leave enough like openings for wonder and say like, something is wrong here, but I don't know what that is. And are there enough clues in the poem left? Or are there enough clues that are there that could give a reader a sense of saying, I think what may have happened. So it's more part of the story versus like what's the deeper meaning or what's the takeaway. It's just what's happened. And so giving too much, I think, makes a poem feel less like of a living thing. Like like a living thing in terms of like when I'm talking to people, I don't want to be doing all the talking. Hopefully I'm not coming across as too talking right now, but I want to hear back. I want there to be a conversation there. So you want there to be enough in the poem that says, here, I'm going to open up a conversation, but I want you to respond, and then I want to be able to respond to your response. And there's no formula, there's no sense of like, what's the process to get there. I think reading a ton of poems, giving it to someone else is going to give you very honest feedback. I want, you know, like the people who see my drafts are like really honest. And they're like, this is not working. My wife is like the person who always is like the harsh, you know, the hardest person to impress. And I need that, like I appreciate that. And so I think that's kind of a long-winded answer to that, but I am writing for other people like that. It's rare that I know there's some writers are like, I'm writing this for myself, whether it reaches an audience is secondary. And for me, it's all about the audience. It's all about me writing, but I'm like, I am thinking of people out there. I am thinking of people that I want to either, like you said, give them information about family or history or about myself, or get them to think, or like Samantha said, get them to feel a certain thing. But I think some of that thinking is so stretched over the course of the time that it takes to draft and revise. And one thing I'll say about drafting is I'll write a first draft, I'll copy and paste that draft underneath the poem, and then I'll revise the one on top. And then I'll copy and paste that, put it right above the two drafts, revise that one. And so I have this like running document that's also kind of the sense of timed, they're not always timestamped. If I'm on a Google Doc, I'll get the timestamps, but I can go back to the beginning and say, where was I when I started? And if it's important for me to stay connected to that initial impulse, I have the initial draft there. Or is it that was just the beginning, where it has gone since is more important, and I don't worry so much about the original ones. I like having those things. I like having these long, messy documents.
That's cool. That's part of the story, right?
It's part of the story, yes.
Of how that came to be.
Yes, and so I think even, and that thinking is not happening on the page necessarily, but it's definitely happening as I'm moving back and forth with what I'm, and I like working on a computer because I can manipulate, I can move things around a little bit more easily than in a notebook.
I think that question about what to leave out is such an important one for all of us as writers, whether we're writing poetry or whether we're writing fiction. It's trusting the reader to fill in the blanks. And I think the best stories are the ones that don't tell the whole story, that leave some of those spaces for the reader to fill in their story. And they do it. You know, we might think they're not going to get it, but they are. So I think that's a really important part of writing and the lesson of writing. My
Yes.
next question is for both of you. What inspires you to write a poem? Is it something you see? Is it something you experience? How do you choose what to write about? Faisal, do you want to start?
Sure. For me, it's like everything. I mean, just like being alive is enough sometimes. I mean, it depends on. I mean, there are times where like I haven't written anything in a week, and then I get to that point where I'm like, I have to write something today, and then I'm like, everything I look at is the potential for something to write, and so whatever it is, and that'll be a problem. Other times I'm like, I'm feeling something and I really want to speak, and so. And then sometimes it's just how much open time do I have during my day to just to think, and then in those moments, like something will jump out. Other times I'm reading. If I'm reading, I get a lot of ideas from that, and so if I ever get writer's block, that's for me is a reminder. Go open up a book. Like that's what you need to do right now.
Yeah. And you, Dan?
For me, it's kind of a necessary activity to get the things out of my head. Every day it can be an idea or a problem or something, and poetry is a way for me to explore that as a start, maybe of something bigger. I like the idea. Poetry is it's a short form. It's a small investment. It's a great way to explore an idea. And many of my poems, when I'm finished, that's kind of the end of the story. Often, that idea just keeps, coming back and nagging at me, and it'll prompt me to develop it further, whether it be into a short story, and sometimes it's even led to even a longer form. So for me, it's a necessary thing. I write stuff down. I'm a big fan of journaling, and so poetry is a way for me to force myself to write in my journal what's going on in my head, get that stuff out to make room for all the other stuff that's coming.
Faisal, maybe you can help me and others like me who are poetry challenged. Um, what do you consider the elements of poetry? What should we be looking for?
I think for me, there are like two things that are most important, and one I'll start with like the box that a poem is, like there's like the structure of it, and so if you have a form in mind, then that one gives you the box. Otherwise, for me, like what that box is like, I just want to I'm working with lines. Like I don't write a lot of prose poems, but there are some really important prose poems that are that I have a few of my own, but I tend to love the work of like creating a line and a line break. And sometimes and this could be this is kind of a nice exercise that I like to do myself sometimes. I'll if I'm reading something, especially if it's online, I'll copy and paste a paragraph or a section that I really like. This could be from a newspaper article in the Chicago Tribune, or it could be from a book I'm reading or whatever, and I'll copy it into a document, and I'll start breaking it into lines and say, how would I shape the poem? So for me, that's the number one element, is like, what's not the most important one, but the one that I kind of start with. So that first thing is, what do I want to say, and when am I going to hit the enter button? Or when am I going to move my pen to the next line on the page if I'm writing by hand? And once that happens, that first enter taking me to the next line, I feel like now I've begun writing a poem. And then the second thing is just like, can I find words that I enjoy or they sound nice, and there's like the sound of it? And so I might say something about, I was mowing the lawn today, and I might say I was mowing the lawn today, like 4 different lines. And by taking a sentence that's very simple, reshaping it, it's a poem. And then I'll say, well, I have the word lawn and I have the word mowing. What are some words that sound like lawn? And so I might say alone. So I was mowing the lawn alone today. And then I'll say, what's another word that sounds like mowing? And I'll say moaning, for example. This is just like how my brain is working. And so I ask myself, where can the word moaning fit into the poem. Okay, I was mowing alone the lawn today while the lawnmower was moaning. And then I'm okay, now what's next? Okay, can I take the sounds of moaning and move the sounds around? So I have M and N, and I'll say, well, N and M. So naming or so whatever that is. So I'm like looking for things that I've already put on the page and trying to extract new words from them. It's again, there's nothing significant about mowing the lawn. It's just, that's how where I started. And then sometimes like that word, well, why is alone important? Why is the word moan important? What does alone plus moan suggest? Okay, there's something wrong here. And so that'll open up the door for something. And so I think it's like writing, but I think what happens sometimes is people will write a draft and then say, I'm done now, versus saying, let me go back and see what is it that I still can work with and change, make it different, make it new, make it strange, whatever that is. And so that's part of why I'll copy and paste the draft and go with that. And I, you know, not every poem works that way, but it would be the starting. Some suggestions I'd give for people who want to start playing a little bit more on the
And is it about the rhythm? Is that what you're looking for, or the words, or?
So the rhythm I don't think too much about until later on. Like I'll start reading things out loud and I'll say, well, you know, I'm not always counting syllables, but I'll listen to it and I'll say something feels off here. But as soon as you break a line and you have the next line, for me, like there's a slight pause that happens, whether it's as I'm reading it or visually. So anytime you insert a slight pause, that changes the rhythm or it creates a sense of rhythm. And so I'm listening for them, but it's more often just about what are the words that are there. Like what's a word that, you know, and there's the great poet Lucille Clifton, who like, she's writing, you know, wrote these like really powerful poems, and oftentimes they're seen as simple, and they're not simple. It's that she found the perfect word to say the perfect thing in the most perfect way. And I think there's also that. There's sometimes this, I want to add extra words because they sound nice with the poem. And other times it's like, I just want to cut to the chase and say what needs to be said. And sometimes I just want to put things on the page that are neither. It's like, it's not necessarily, there's just other ways of writing as well.
If I could add on to that, I'm always curious about the idea of, you know, does the form dictate the development of the poem, or does the idea drive what it will look like when you're finished on the page? And maybe I can use an example. I'll just hold this up. This is your poem, Prayer. So if you know, that's a very unique form for a poem, which I love, but did you know you were going to structure it on the page that way when you started? Or did you write it first and then, you know, say, I need to structure it differently to communicate a different meaning?
Yeah, so that poem in particular, thank you also for all the kind words. And you've been very generous with your reading, and thank you, Dan. So that one I did not write in that structure until the very end of the writing. And so I wrote the poem, I was working on drafts, and then for Muslims, we have like the 5 daily prayers. And so I started thinking about, this is a poem about prayer. Number 5 is really significant to that number is really important. There's 5 pillars of Islam, there's the 5 daily prayers. And so I thought, like, if I put them in like 5 stanzas or 5 sections, how would that work? And then I started playing, I'm like, what are other ways in which 5 can be worked with? And so then I have you'll see like there's a stanza here and another, it kind of, it's staggered. There's like 10 sections, but they go kind of like this.
Right.
And I was thinking of like, there's a pathway being carved in this one towards God or towards holiness, or what that is. And so the 5 prayers are like holding, almost like being these like guideposts along a meandering path that are guided. So that was very consciously part of the design, but near the very end, like I think I'd probably written words of it and maybe adjusted some of the words once the structure started taking shape. And then at some point, it just is a feeling of like, now it feels right. Because I think that was something, I remember like thinking about this poem, like, you know, imagining this moment right now, if someone asked me about this form, what would I say? There are other forms where I don't have a very specific rationale for it. It just feels right. But for that one, it was very deliberate. And then someone read it and they said it's almost like prayer mats placed on each one as like a different person can join the prayer on the prayer mat. And which prior to COVID, I felt like, well, that's not, you know, when we pray, we're standing in these very straight lines. Like our feet are right next to each other. And what's happened with COVID is when, you know, there's not many, but, you know, we had the Eid prayer after Ramadan last month and people were scattered around the space for social distancing. I'm like, oh, so you don't have to do it in a certain lined, rigid manner. Just showing up for the prayer is more, you know, engaging in that worship is more important than like the specifics of what you're doing on the ground. And so that also felt like, okay, the poem makes sense that way too, or it can make sense that way too.
Very
That's
cool.
interesting how you structured that particular poem, and that's something that I've always wondered about. How do you know how to break the poem? I mean, you had a very specific reason for that particular one, but how do you know how to break the poem? How many lines there are in a stanza, what to capitalize, what not to how to use punctuation, how do you make those determinations?
And do you want to talk about like how you make those decisions? Because I think it's so different for different people, and it's also different between poems.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're following traditional forms of poetry, there are very strict rules. Um, a lot of contemporary, maybe I'll say most of contemporary poetry today is more free verse, where um, those rules are made up maybe by the writer, if that's safe to say. And the idea is, what do you want to get across in that line? What are those words getting across? And when that message is made, then you can move on to the next line. I think word choice and how the lines and the words sit on the page, for me, make a big difference. When I'm reading, I'm looking for those kind of structural things, and those words and groups of words, how they stand out, how they impact me. And so as I'm reading other poets, I'm following, kind of what I'm interested in looking for. And I think I write the same way. I won't say that I have any, magic idea or expertise on how and when to make that determination, except I know for myself when to make that determination, and how it allows me to communicate the story or the message to the reader.
Does it have for you a subliminal message that you want the reader to get?
Sometimes it can, sometimes it doesn't need to be. Everyone, what I found is, I read differently, whether depending on what I'm reading and what poet I'm reading. And I think everyone reads differently. And so I think it's good to give the reader options, whether it's in terms of line structure or page form. Uh, Give the reader options to see what they take to the best. And I think Faisal, you've certainly done that in this book. I mean, it's a wide variety of different approaches to telling your stories, visually, structurally, and I think as a writer, I try not to. For me, I try not to get too caught up. I think there has to be some form and structure, but it's what is the story you're trying to convey, and how do you get across most effectively? And for me, like you mentioned, Samantha, in an accessible way. I don't necessarily want to be, I don't want to spell it all out for the reader. I want the reader to think about, what I may be communicating, but it needs to be accessible. And at the end, hopefully the reader reads it and says, wow, it's interesting or moving, or I need to think about that more, some kind of reaction. And so that's just a long-winded way to say, I think as a writer, you have the ability to make those decisions based upon what you're trying to accomplish, and do what you think makes sense.
Yeah, Dan, I love your answer. I think so much is about that. Like, what is it you're thinking about the reader, thinking about like what you're trying to say? I mean, sometimes it's a sense of if a line is too long, a reader can get the eye, like you're thinking about like their reading. And so you're like, if I've got a lot of long lines, I might want to put more visual breaks in terms of create more stanzas just to give their eye a breath in some way and make it, it's like, the analogy I use is like if you have a paragraph that's really long, just before someone's even started reading it, they're like, wow, this is a long paragraph. That first thought sometimes is like you're moving back. And the analogy I give my students sometimes is like you just ordered pizza, the pizza arrives and no one has sliced it up for you. Your first thought is, I'm annoyed right now. I mean, it doesn't take that much work to cut it up yourself. But if you're thinking about like how do you want the reader to feel, just on a more subtle level, and how you want them to like navigate the reading experience. I love when poets read their work, and sometimes I want to read along with them, and sometimes I just want to hear. This is many years ago, so I feel like I was really lucky to do this, but I saw Louise Gluck give a reading at the University of Chicago. And someone during the Q&A was like, oh, wow, you're such a great reader of your work. And her response was, I'm going to paraphrase, but she goes, oh, I hate reading my work out loud. And I'm using strong language just to kind of make the point, but she said, I don't want the poet's voice to tell me how I should experience a poem. I want my eye, my moment and my time with the poem give me options in how I'm going to read it. So Dan, that's exactly what you said. Like you want the reader to consume it or read it or enjoy it or appreciate it on their terms. And so what the poet does is, or the fiction writer or any writer, artist, whatever, is make decisions that set up a certain way that you want to guide the reader through the process. When you end a chapter, when you start a next chapter, what do you want to withhold? What do you want to tell them right away? It's about taking command of the experience that you want the reader to have without telling them what you want them to think or feel, letting that kind of happen on their own terms too.
Sometimes I feel like the line breaks or the punctuation or the capitalization, I feel like I'm missing out on what the poet is trying to tell me. And it frustrates me. And I feel like I should understand that more.
Yeah. I'm not sure it's understandable.
Yes.
From a grand perspective. Again, you can read 1,000 different poets and you'll get 1,000 different kind of approaches to communicating that poem, whether it's punctuation or capitalization, line break. I'm not sure there's always a rule that that you need to follow as a reader. Again, unless it's a traditionally structured poem that has rules. Yeah, I think it's a great question, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily answerable. I think the answer more is it's just read the words and follow the line until the normal punctuation comes and see what you get from it.
I think that maybe I get too hung up on it. And instead of just reading the words and trying to understand it, maybe I have to figure things out. That's my personality. So I want to understand what's behind it. And maybe like you say, Dan, I should just read the words
And like I said before, if it doesn't touch you in some way, go on to the next poet or the next book from that poet. Maybe give the person a second chance, but or the next poem. You know, every poem you read is not going to be you know, the greatest thing you ever read or experienced.
right.
And the great thing is that there are so many more to jump into. Give them all a try.
I want to ask you both about um, what makes a poem and not prose. Yeah, so you want to start with
Sure, I can, yeah. So I'm gonna just share, just a follow up on kind of Dan's previous point, the question of punctuation, but just about like figuring things out. Like not everything can be figured out. There's a great movie from 2009 called Bright Star about John Keats and in the last couple of years of his life. Really beautiful movie. But there's a moment, I actually put it up on my screen. I'm like, maybe there'll be a chance to share this. I think this might be a good time. So there's like him and a woman named Fanny Braun who they're in a romantic relationship. And she says in the movie, she goes, I still don't know how to work out a poem. And his response, I don't know if it's based on something he wrote. I don't know his work that well, but Keats says in the movie, a poem needs understanding through the senses. The point of diving in a lake is not immediately to swim to the shore, but to be in the lake, to luxuriate in the sensation of water. You do not work the lake out. It is an experience beyond thought. And I love that. It's like sometimes you're in it to feel a certain way, and that's it. Like, and the other thing I'll say about punctuation, like for me, it's about consistency as well. Like, because that prayer poem, nothing is capitalized. There's no punctuation at all. And that's rare for me. For some reason that made sense. I don't know, I can't really speak to that right now. But usually I'm gonna capitalize the first word of a sentence, put a period at the end. And if the sentence continues on the next line, because that word wasn't capitalized in the original sentence, I'm not gonna capitalize it. So I'm just gonna follow those rules. There's other poems where the first word of every line is capitalized, the first letter of it. And it's a choice that's made. I've done that a few times, and I think it's something to look at and kind of say, okay, maybe there's something meaningful. Oftentimes, it's just part of the way that it's built. From kind of, if you look at it from an architectural point of view, it isn't. Not every detail in a building has a function. It just sometimes is like, that's a cool looking detail. That makes it look pretty, or that the color of that trim matches something else, but there's nothing else to really say about it except it looks nice or it caught my attention.
and it isn't,
Like you said, the Dan is like, if it's distracting, let it go and then move on if it's really preventing an appreciation of the poem.
and isn't, it makes it look pretty. That's a function all in itself.
That's a huge function. That's I think one of the most important functions. And with the question about like what's a poem and what's a story and where's the line. I mean, when you had sent some questions over, that's probably the one I thought about the most. And I'm like, I don't know. Like, I know what a poem is, and I can tell you, but I can't tell you what a poem isn't. I mean, there's someone will look at a picture of, someone will point to a flower and say, that's a poem right there. Someone will point to the sky and say, this sky today is a poem. So I can't help with that, except I think just reading a lot of poems or like keeping your mind open. And the label is less important than the interaction, that experience you have with whatever it is you're looking at or reading.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. Probably one that we've all asked ourselves 100 times.
Yeah.
What is poem versus prose versus a prose poem? And how do those latter two differentiate? Yeah, I'm a big fan of the prose poem. I think that is a great way to tell a story. And look, poetry for me is just another way to tell a story. I can't make it any more complicated than that. I have an idea, it's something I want to convey, and it's a form to allow me to do that. I think if I had to pick out a few things that, for me, delineate poetry from anything else, is it's shorter form. Its form individually for each poem, effective word choice, I think is absolutely critical. It can rhyme, but it doesn't have to, and it very often does not. But because you have such a short amount of time to convey what you're trying to convey, I think word choice is maybe one of the more critical aspects. And you certainly touched on that, talking about line breaks, and similar sounding words, that's certainly part of it. You have one chance in this short form to get across what you're saying. So I think you think a lot more about the words and how they help you communicate that meaning.
This is such a fascinating discussion. Thank you guys both so much. There are a couple of questions in the chat that I wanted to get to. Some of them are quite long, and that makes it a little difficult, but Sean asked, Dan, you seem to be moving back and forth between fiction and poetry. Do you find that difficult, like having to rediscover a different gear each time?
I guess I wouldn't say that I'm going back and forth. I've always been writing poetry, and again, it's the way for me to explore that initial idea, and then it maybe takes on a larger form. So poetry has been a constant, and then I change form between short stories and novels, and I don't find that problematic. I'm a big fan of that building block theory. Start small, build it into something bigger if it makes sense, right? I've always had this fear that you'd write a novel and it was just awful after spending 2 years of your life. Well, I like to explore an idea as a poem first, or maybe a short story, and if it has merit, then maybe I'll make it further develop it into a larger form. If not, nothing lost. I have this shorter piece that I can publish as a short story or as a poem, and I think it was mentioned before, the idea of being caught in a writer's block. Poetry is a great way to get out of it. I'm a big fan of having multiple projects at the same time, right? And if you get stuck on one thing, leave it. Go write a poem. You can always write a poem, right? It may not be great, but you can always write a poem in a couple hours, in a day. So
it inspires
I think, yeah, and I think poetry can coexist with other forms of writing, and for me, it has to.
This is a question for Faisal. Is there something that happens in you, a feeling, impulse, thought, maybe even a physical sensation when you realize the poem has surfaced?
There is a feeling. It's one of those feelings where there's a poet named Kavi Akbar, who I'm a big fan of. He had a really great analogy where you're just like rolling, or you're trying, like you have like this wheel that you're kind of like pushing forward, and for a long time it's not even rolling. Your goal is just to get it to roll, and then at some point it starts to roll, and you get this feeling of momentum, kind of like I'm moving now, I'm into something. And this can happen. I mean, when I was doing more fiction, I would feel that as well. I have found that track. I'm on that track now. And the part of the analogy of his that I loved is they said at some point you realize the ending of the poem is right there. It's not directly ahead of you, and you start to lean, and the wheel leans with you, and it starts to curve that way. And all you're doing is like writing to keep the wheel rolling, like giving it enough space to. And this is like an all abstraction metaphoric, but it's like an answer. Like when he shared that with me, I was like, oh, I know that feeling. And then when you get to the ending, you're like, okay, I've gotten here. And then the job is like, let me look backward and say, okay, how do I go back and kind of like straighten out all the stuff that was not part of the track? Like I've made a mess. The track is laid now. Let me go and clean that mess up. But I'm still going to arrive here. And once you're in that mode, the feeling kind of goes away then. And then you're like, okay, I have made this awesome. I'm going to use the sculpture analogy because Margot McMahon is here, but I've made the sculpture, it's done, but now I got to clean up the studio because stuff is everywhere.
This question is for both of you. How do you confront hard topics in your poetry? Are there some poems that take forever to write because it's hard for you as a person to process?
Dan, do you want to go first on this one?
I mean, I think it's a great question. And I think it's one of the reasons for writing poetry is to help you explore that. You know, it's a hard topic, maybe pressing on your mind. I won't say it's easy. No better way than to attempt to get it out of your head and address it by exploring it through poetry. And, you know, sometimes it's easier than others. I find it's important for me to just stick through until the end. Because unless you do, you're going to be caught up with it forever, right? I mean, we are struggling with these hard topics all the time. We need to process them. We need to write them down so that we can move on. So just keep at it.
Yeah, I think what I would add to that is like who is also part of this poem, like who am I speaking about, or who am I speaking for, or who am I responding to and maybe speaking against, and also thinking about them or keeping them. I don't want to, you know, there are times I've written things that are really important to me, like they're expressing something strong, but I know if this poem reaches a certain, or someone read this poem, it would upset them. And so then I have to like, I know this is true for nonfiction writers a lot. Like, do I want this story out there? Do I want this to be known? That can make it a more complicated process to be like, I am going to just stop now. I've got it out for me. But if I want to pursue it further, then to what extent do I care about other people's feelings? And those matter a lot to me. Like if there's people I care about, I do care. Not that I need their approval, or I'm trying to like make them feel good about everything, but I want to be mindful of the impact on others. This is really big on, you know, like political topics, and you know, sometimes people get very politicized in their writing or their reading, and I don't operate that way. Where I'm like, I have very strong feelings about things, but I'm usually like, I always have an agenda that I'm trying to get across when I'm writing, especially when I'm writing poems. That's not always true, but I'm thinking about like, how are people going to feel? How are the people that I care most about going to feel? And how are the people who I really need this message to be heard by going to feel? And so I think that adds to the time it takes to get something finished, if it even like, I mean, that can prevent it from getting finished at all too, which Dan, you were saying, like, sometimes you just have to do it, like get it out and then move on.
Well, you don't have to let it out, you know.
That's true as well, yes.
You can finish it and get it out of you.
Yes, absolutely.
And as you say, then make the determination of how to, you know, if you want to make it public, revise it accordingly, but
sure, yes.
Get it out of yourself first and alleviate that hard burden from you.
Yes. And I think one of the rules that I've been taught, I also kind of say is like, if you've written something and it goes out into the world, can you stand up for it? Can you stand with it? Because a lot of people get challenged at what they say. And if we're not careful, like it can be harder to stand up. And if I've made a mistake or if I've hurt somebody, like I want to acknowledge that. I want to, you know, make amends, whatever. But I think when we're writing about really difficult topics, people's emotions get involved, and that can, not just like an emotional response to a poem, but I may feel hurt, or I may have experienced a hurt that someone's poem or someone's piece, you know, triggers some kind of trauma or re-traumatization from it. And so I want to, and if that happens, I've had some situations I've written things and people have been upset by them. And I want to engage in a conversation with them whenever possible to kind of say, look, whether I intended to do it or not, that's part of it, but it had an impact on you. I also want to acknowledge and talk about that.
Thank you guys so much. We're running a little over on time, but I wanted to read something Karen wrote. She said, I find I get more out of a poem if I read it more than once, especially if it's a short poem. And that just makes so much sense, because even if you read something, maybe you don't connect with it, but if you read it a second time or even a third time, maybe that connection will show up when you least expect it. So I want to thank you both for joining me today. This has been a wonderful discussion, and thank you everyone for being here. I'll be posting the link to the recording later today or tomorrow. And I hope to see you next month for Cocktails and Conversation on the first Sunday of the month. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Samantha. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you,
Thank you, everyone, for being here.